A nuclear power plant just got hit, not in a war game, not in a simulation. In real life, last night, and the United States military did not wait until morning to respond. What happened in the next 4 hours changed the rules of this entire conflict in ways that nobody was prepared for. Welcome to FlashPoint Intel. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and tap the bell, because this channel covers the stories that the mainstream news cycle buries under the noise. And right now, there is no bigger story on the planet than what just happened between Iran, a nuclear facility, and the United States military response that followed. Subscribe. Stay with me, because this one is going to take your full attention. Let us start with what we actually know, and let us be precise about it, because in a story involving nuclear infrastructure, the difference between what is confirmed and what is speculation matters enormously. The Bushehr Nuclear Power Plant, located on the northeastern shore of the Persian Gulf in southern Iran, sustained strike damage in an attack that Iranian and regional sources are attributing to Iranian military action. The circumstances surrounding how Iranian ordnance ended up striking Iranian nuclear infrastructure are complicated, and we're going to work through all of them. But the core fact is this: a nuclear power plant on the Persian Gulf coast took a hit, radiation monitoring systems in the region activated, the International Atomic Energy Agency issued an emergency statement, and within hours, United States military assets in the theater shifted from their standard operational posture to something significantly more aggressive. To understand why this moment is so significant, you have to understand what Bushehr actually is and what it represents in the broader architecture of this conflict. Bushehr is Iran's only operational nuclear power plant. It was built with Russian assistance over a period of decades and has been a source of enormous national pride for the Iranian government since it came online. The plant generates approximately 1,000 megawatts of electrical power for the Iranian grid, which matters for a country whose civilian infrastructure has been under significant stress throughout this conflict. But Bushehr's significance goes beyond electricity generation. The plant represents Iran's public face of civilian nuclear technology, the argument that the Islamic Republic makes to international audiences that its nuclear program has legitimate peaceful dimensions. It is the facility that Iranian officials point to when they want to demonstrate that they are a modern state with sophisticated technological capabilities, not a rogue program hiding weapons work behind the claim of civilian use. The Russian connection to Bushehr adds another layer of complexity that is going to matter as this story develops. Russia built the plant. Russian technicians have been involved in its operation. Russian nuclear fuel contracts have sustained its function. A strike on Bushehr is not just a strike on Iranian infrastructure. It is a strike on a facility with deep Russian fingerprints, and Moscow is going to have something to say about that. Now let us talk about how Iranian ordnance ended up hitting an Iranian nuclear plant, because this is the part of the story that the headlines are not explaining clearly. The engagement picture over the Persian Gulf in the hours leading up to the Bushehr strike was extraordinarily complex. American naval forces and Iranian military assets had been engaged in the kind of multi-vector confrontation that has become the signature of this conflict's most intense phases. Drone swarms, fast attack boat harassment, cruise missile launches from coastal positions, Iranian ballistic missiles targeting American naval assets in the Gulf. The engagement zone was saturated with weapons, moving in multiple directions at multiple altitudes and multiple speeds simultaneously. American Aegis combat systems were tracking and intercepting Iranian weapons. Iranian air defense systems were attempting to track American strike packages. And in that environment of maximum confusion and maximum electronic warfare activity, something went wrong on the Iranian side in a way that produced a catastrophic own goal. The working assessment from defense analysts tracking the operational picture is that an Iranian surface-to-air missile fired by Iranian air defense systems attempting to intercept what they assessed as an incoming American strike lost guidance lock on its intended target and reacquired on the Bushehr facility itself. The electromagnetic environment over the Gulf during a high-intensity engagement is extraordinarily complicated. American electronic warfare systems aboard F-35s and EA-18G Growlers are specifically designed to create exactly the kind of sensor confusion that causes adversary air defense systems to malfunction, misidentify targets, and in extreme cases, turn their own weapons against their own assets. Whether what happened at Bushehr was the result of American electronic warfare causing the guidance failure, or a mechanical malfunction in the Iranian missile system, or a targeting error by an Iranian crew operating under extreme stress in a chaotic engagement environment, the physical result was the same. An Iranian missile struck the Bushehr power plant. The immediate radiation concern was the first thing that every monitoring system in the region focused on. Bushehr uses a VVER-1000 reactor design, a Russian pressurized water reactor. The reactor was reportedly in a reduced operational state at the time of the strike, which matters significantly for the radiation release calculation. A reactor at full power that takes a direct structural hit is a fundamentally different scenario from a reactor operating at reduced capacity, where the strike damages peripheral infrastructure rather than the reactor core itself. Early assessments from the IAEA and from independent radiation monitoring networks suggest that the strike damaged turbine hall infrastructure and some associated buildings, rather than the reactor containment structure directly. This is critically important. A compromised containment structure would mean a Chernobyl-level event that would make everything else in this conflict secondary to the immediate humanitarian and environmental catastrophe. The current picture, while still being assessed, suggests the reactor core integrity was maintained even as peripheral infrastructure took significant damage. But that picture can change, and the monitoring systems are watching every reading very carefully. The United States military response began before the radiation assessment was even complete. This is the part of the story that tells you everything about where American command authority is operating right now and what the rules of engagement look like in this theater. Within 90 minutes of the Bushehr strike, CENTCOM issued a statement that was precise, calm, and deeply alarming for anyone who understood what it actually said underneath the institutional language. The statement confirmed that American forces were aware of the incident at Bushehr, that radiation monitoring was active, that American assets were not responsible for the strike, and that the United States military was prepared to respond to any attempt by Iranian forces to exploit the confusion created by the incident. That last phrase, respond to any attempt to exploit the confusion, is diplomatic language for something very specific. It means American commanders assessed that Iranian hardline elements might attempt to use the chaos of the Bushehr incident as cover for offensive operations, and CENTCOM was putting everyone on notice that such an attempt would be met with immediate and disproportionate force. The physical military response that followed the statement was visible to the entire region. American carrier strike group assets repositioned. Additional F-35 sorties went airborne. The guided missile destroyers in the Gulf of Oman adjusted their operational posture. And most significantly, B-2 Spirit stealth bombers, already positioned in the theater at Diego Garcia, were reported by multiple regional aviation tracking sources to have entered flight activity patterns, consistent with pre-strike preparation. The B-2 matters here more than any other platform because of what it can carry. The B-2 is the platform capable of delivering the massive ordnance penetrator, the 30,000-pound bunker-busting bomb designed specifically to destroy deeply buried and hardened underground facilities. The facilities that the B-2 and the MOP together were designed for include exactly the kind of hardened underground nuclear infrastructure that Iran has been constructing at Fordo and Natanz. The Iranian regime's communication in the immediate aftermath of the Bushehr strike was chaotic in a way that revealed genuine internal confusion at the command level. State media initially reported that American aircraft had struck Bushehr, which was the narrative the regime needed to explain the incident to its domestic audience. When it became clear that American forces were denying responsibility and that the physical evidence was pointing toward an Iranian missile malfunction, the state media narrative shifted to claiming that the strike was the result of American electronic warfare deliberately causing an Iranian missile to misfire, a claim that is technically possible and has some supporting logic, but that also constitutes an admission that Iranian air defense systems can be manipulated into firing on their own facilities by American electronic warfare. Neither version of the story is good for the Iranian government's credibility. Either Iran's enemies struck a nuclear plant and Iran could not stop them, or Iran's own air defense system struck its own nuclear plant because American electronic warfare made it happen. Both narratives are operationally devastating, for the IRGC's claim that its defensive architecture is capable of protecting Iranian territory. The IRGC hardline faction's response to this operational and political crisis has been to lean into escalation as the only move that maintains their institutional credibility. This is the pattern that FlashPoint Intel has been tracking throughout this conflict. Every time the hardliners experience a significant operational setback, the institutional response is to escalate rather than consolidate, to make a larger aggressive move that reframes the narrative from one of Iranian failure to one of Iranian defiance. The logic is internal political rather than militarily rational. The hardliners need to demonstrate to the Iranian population and to the regime's own power structure that they are still capable of imposing costs on the enemy. A defensive posture after Bushehr would look like defeat. Offensive escalation, even if it produces worse military outcomes, looks like resistance. And resistance is the only political currency the hardline faction has. This is why the CENTCOM statement about responding to attempts to exploit the confusion was not bureaucratic boilerplate. It was a specific warning aimed at a specific faction whose behavioral pattern CENTCOM analysts understand very well. The warning was also a message to Iranian moderating elements that American patience has real limits and that the window for a different outcome is closing. Let us talk about Russia's position here, because Moscow is about to become a much louder voice in this story, and most American media coverage is going to underweight that dimension. Russia built Bushehr. Russian nuclear fuel is in the reactor. Russian technical staff have been involved in this facility's operation throughout its existence, although the specific status of Russian personnel at the plant at the time of the strike is not confirmed. Moscow has a legitimate grievance regardless of who is actually responsible for the strike. If American electronic warfare caused an Iranian missile to hit a Russian-built facility, Russia has a basis for a formal complaint against the United States. If Iranian air defense incompetence caused the strike, Russia has a basis for a formal complaint against Iran about the safety of its nuclear facility operations. Either way, Putin has been handed a political card that he can play in multiple directions, and Russian strategic communication is already beginning to exploit the ambiguity. The Russian calculation here is complicated in exactly the way that suits Moscow's interests. Russia does not want Iran destroyed, because a weakened Iran removes a useful tool in Russia's strategy of maintaining pressure on American interests in multiple theaters simultaneously. But Russia also does not want to be seen as the enabler of Iranian aggression that is now producing nuclear safety incidents on a plant with Russian technology. The Bushehr strike gives Moscow an opportunity to position itself as a responsible nuclear power calling for de-escalation, which is a narrative that serves Russian interests in Europe and in international forums, even as Russia continues to quietly provide whatever support it can to Iran through channels that maintain deniability. The International Atomic Energy Agency response has been swift and has introduced an international legal and diplomatic dimension to this incident that extends well beyond the bilateral American-Iranian confrontation. The IAEA Director General activated emergency protocols and dispatched a monitoring team to the region. The agency's ability to get inspectors physically into Bushehr in the current conflict environment is uncertain, but the activation of emergency protocols is significant because it triggers reporting requirements to the UN Security Council that bring the full weight of international nuclear governance into the picture. China, which just recently signaled a cooling in its relationship with Iran, is on the Security Council and will have to take a public position on a nuclear safety incident involving a country it has been quietly supporting. That position is going to be uncomfortable for Beijing regardless of which direction it goes. The energy markets responded to the Bushehr strike with the kind of acute volatility that the Iranian strategic doctrine always counted on. Brent crude jumped sharply on the news because a nuclear incident on the Persian Gulf coast combined with intensifying American military activity in the strait is exactly the kind of event that triggers energy market panic. But here's the thing that is worth watching carefully over the next 48 hours. The spike may not hold. The reason it may not hold is the same reason that the Iranian doctrine of using energy market disruption as geopolitical leverage has been underperforming throughout this conflict. The alternative routing infrastructure, the UAE's Fujairah pipeline, the Saudi Petroline, has been absorbing Persian Gulf supply disruptions in ways that limit the market's acute vulnerability to strait events. If the radiation assessment confirms that reactor containment was maintained and that the environmental catastrophe scenario is off the table, the market may settle back down faster than the initial reaction suggests. And a market that does not sustain a panic spike after an Iranian nuclear plant gets hit is a market that is priced in a significant amount of Hormuz risk already, which means the economic leverage that Iranian doctrine depends on is even more degraded than it looked before last night. The conversation that is happening inside the Iranian regime right now, in the deep bunkers where senior IRGC commanders and regime leadership have been operating since the security compromises that followed earlier incidents in this conflict, is a conversation about an institution facing simultaneous crises on multiple dimensions. The military effectiveness of American systems in the theater has been empirically demonstrated to exceed what Iranian doctrine predicted. The economic backstop that China represented is showing cracks. The Gulf state alignment that Iran counted on fracturing has instead hardened. European diplomatic cover has become more conditional as Iranian behavior in the strait has become harder to defend. And now the Bushehr incident has created a nuclear safety crisis that puts the regime's competence in managing its own weapon systems under international scrutiny at the worst possible moment. The hardline faction's answer to this accumulation of setbacks is more resistance. That is the only answer the hardline faction knows how to give. But the moderating elements within the Iranian system, the factions that have been arguing behind closed doors that the available negotiating framework is better than the alternative the hardliners are producing, now have a powerful new argument to make. The hardliners promised that military resistance was viable. They promised that the doctrine would hold. They promised that American power could be made too expensive to sustain in the theater. Every one of those promises has been operationally tested and found wanting. And now an Iranian missile has struck an Iranian nuclear plant in an incident that has brought the IAEA and the UN Security Council into the picture and given Russia and China both the incentive and the diplomatic cover to distance themselves from Iranian behavior. The American military response in the hours following the Bushehr strike has been calibrated in a way that is consistent with the broader approach CENTCOM has been using throughout this conflict. Maximum demonstrated capability, visible repositioning, credible threat of escalation, but deliberate restraint from the kind of strike that would foreclose a diplomatic resolution. The B-2s that entered pre-strike activity patterns did not strike. The additional F-35 sorties that went airborne returned to base without expending ordnance. The destroyer repositioning was aggressive, but stayed within the operational parameters of the existing rules of engagement. This is the strategy of showing the full hand without playing it, of making clear that the capability to end this conflict on American terms exists and is ready, while keeping the diplomatic door technically open for Iranian decision-makers who want to use it. Trump's public communication following the Bushehr strike has been characteristically direct in a way that carries both domestic and diplomatic messaging simultaneously. The language has been firm on American non-responsibility for the incident, explicit about the readiness of American forces to respond to any Iranian exploitation of the situation, and notably restrained on the question of what the United States plans to do next. That restraint is itself a message. It is an invitation for Iranian moderates to find a way to use this moment as a turning point rather than an accelerant. Whether that invitation gets accepted depends on dynamics inside the Iranian power structure that are genuinely uncertain right now. The Bushehr incident is going to shape this conflict in ways that extend well beyond the immediate military and diplomatic picture. It has introduced the nuclear dimension into the conflict in a way that was always theoretically possible, but has now become operationally real. Every government that has been watching this conflict is now updating its assessment of how far the escalation ladder actually goes and what it looks like at the top. The IAEA's involvement brings international nuclear governance into a bilateral conflict that both sides have been trying to keep from fully internationalizing. Russia's position becomes more complicated and more influential simultaneously. China's already cooling relationship with Iran gets another significant nudge in the direction of distance. And the American military's demonstrated ability to conduct electronic warfare that can penetrate and potentially manipulate Iranian air defense systems, if that is indeed what caused the Bushehr strike, is a capability that changes the security calculation for every country operating Russian-built air defense architecture anywhere in the world. The strait itself, that 21-mile choke point through which the world's energy economy breathes, is now a contested zone where the rules have shifted fundamentally from where they were even 2 weeks ago. Iranian doctrine assumed that the threat of nuclear escalation served as a deterrent that would restrain American military action below certain thresholds. What last night demonstrated is that the nuclear dimension can be introduced into this conflict not by an intentional escalation decision, but by the chaos and confusion of high-intensity conventional combat in a geographically constrained theater where both sides are operating complex weapon systems under enormous stress. That lesson is going to reverberate in military planning rooms far beyond Washington and Tehran. FlashPoint Intel is going to stay on this story as the radiation assessment develops, as the IAEA team attempts to access the site, as Russian and Chinese diplomatic responses take shape, and as the Iranian regime's internal decision-making produces whatever comes next. The next 72 hours are going to tell us whether last night was the moment that broke the hardline faction's grip on Iranian escalation decisions, or whether it was the trigger for one more round of defiance that forces the American military to show what is on the other side of restraint. The B-2s are still on the ramp at Diego Garcia. The F-35s are still ready. The guided missile destroyers are positioned. The massive ordnance penetrator exists for exactly the kind of hardened underground target that Iran has been building for exactly the scenario where conventional deterrence fails. The love tap was delivered weeks ago. The question that last night's events brought into sharp focus is whether the other hand is about to make its appearance, and what the world looks like on the other side of that decision. Now it is your turn. Drop a comment below right now and tell me what you think. Was the Bushehr strike an accident caused by American electronic warfare, an Iranian air defense malfunction, or something else entirely? I want your honest take. This community at FlashPoint Intel is where the real analysis happens, and your perspective matters. Share this video right now with someone who needs to understand what is actually happening in this conflict, because the Bushehr story is the one that connects every other thread we have been following, and most people still do not have the full picture. We will be back with the next update as this develops. Stay sharp, stay informed, and we will see you in the next one.